2 of the revolution. So anyway, I have put together a website for this whole subject. Draft Science Presents Physics, the Do-Over. I like that. It's the photons, stupid. Anyway, playing off the economy, stupid Clinton line. Yeah, it's all photons, and somewhere, in the 1900s, Einstein, the rest, quantum mechanics, this conversation got broken, and people lost sight of, in my opinion, what's really going on. The simple explanation that it's all photons, the entire everything, matter, everything. It's all photons, and they're just building blocks like Legos, and this is what you get. You could make very complicated things out of these Legos, these little pieces, just merely trapping them in circumstances. So everything is moving the speed of light technically. Everything is made out of pieces that are moving the speed of light. They're just moving the speed of light in closed spirals or circles. Anyway, and and so that's the universe. The universe is photons. So there's photons and then there's nothing. And time dilation can be explained. A simple explanation, matter forms, cells. It's all kind of a complex arrangement of the photons. And so you can imagine it like a school of fish doing a figure eight. And if you move the figure eight sideways, the figure eight will have to be created or drawn slower because you have to take more time to do the movement. So any matter that has velocity means that the matter has to move slower in terms of its internal metabolism. So the atomic metabolism is slower, and that explains clocks moving slower, and everything will run slower. That's made out of matter, chemistry. All the chemistry, everything works slower if the chemistry is moving. And movement is all absolute. Space has no magical powers. Photons have no magical powers, even though I'm saying it's the photons, stupid. All of the nuances, anything that looks like a wave or anything other property, are all created by the fact that photons can be trapped in oscillating spirals that will create interactions, effects, that'll make causes look like they were caused by a wave, but no, it's the effect is a creation of a wave, in terms of it's an effect. It's not cause. The photons have no wave property. They can't carry any wave property. They can carry information in the sense of you can change their frequency, and you can change how many of them show up at a place, but that's about it. And in that you can create phenomenon in terms of how the electrons and the atomic structure react, in terms of how they will interact with the photons. I'm tripping over the words just because they don't really interact with the photons. They capture them or they change their direction, but that's really all they can do. So anyway, everything's explained. Gravity, all forces there's no magic forces. All forces are a phenomenon of photons moving, pushing things, changing the shape of things internally. When we're moved by gravity, it's not that gravity is pushing us, it's that gravity is changing us. It's changing all of the rotation of all of the, not all of them of course, but a significant percentage, a sufficient percentage to cause movement. It doesn't take many, but you can just imagine it's like a bunch of bicycle tires that have a certain amount of centrifugal momentum, and if they're a little lopsided but they're all pointed in the same direction, then the thing will tend to move in that direction. So whatever way the directionality of how the rotations are pointed will decide where something will tend to move. And so it's the photons of gravity change our internal structure, which compels our internal structure to move towards the center of the Earth. So it's not technically being pushed, it's technically the school of fish is just reoriented, so the fish aren't just spiraling in random directions in an even potential. They tend to be more of them moving in one direction, and it doesn't take many to be moving in a direction for the whole school to start migrating. Yeah. So, so magnetism, gravity, all these things are made of the same thing. It's all photons. And there's a subtle difference between gravity and magnetism. I have explained in previous videos. I'll explain again, and hopefully better illustrations. We'll see. Hopefully that's what will happen. I was going to do this video better, but it just don't really have time when I get started and start plotting things on the website. So the website's going to have a video index. Will be just the videos and explanation of what the video says, and then a subject index, which will point to what videos have information on particular subjects like gravity, magnetism, quantum mechanics, that kind of thing, and some write-up on those subjects. Of course, there'll still be links to the older previous videos, and there'll be just a refinement of the content as I move along. And so I'll just start with the basic idea. These aren't things that are said for sure yet, but I'm quite certain of them. Some of them are have been written as postulates. But the idea is that there's just photons, and when they're trapped, when you know a photon, you know it as something that has a frequency. So there's a frequency of distance between the photons, and we call that a certain kind of energy, a certain kind of wave thing. And what it could be is, there's people who will say that there's, a single photon of cosmic rays or some X-ray or something has more energy than, say, ultraviolet photon. But there's no knowing a photon except as a packet, as something that contains a frequency. So I would argue that anything that we detect as a certain kind of electromagnetic particle is something that's coming in a pair at minimum. And it could be 5 or 6 or 10 of these things in a row, and then another 5 or 6 or 10 of them are very similarly produced. So they're probably produced in blobs of certain amounts. And our eye interprets them. Certain ones it recognizes, certain ones it doesn't. So it doesn't see the infrared ones that are hitting my eye all the time. The ultraviolet ones, it doesn't see them. The X-rays, whatever else is bouncing around, the microwaves, the radio waves, it doesn't see any of those photons. It doesn't recognize them. It doesn't react to them. Even though they're there, even though they pass right through my eye, my eye doesn't see them, doesn't recognize them. And so the atoms themselves are selective in what they both produce and what they will react to, what they'll create a reaction to. But it's all the same photons, they're just in different spacing. So the frequency is a key concept, but there is no wave function. This is all there is. There's just distance between photons. They're all the same, whether it be a radio wave, whether it be radio or ultraviolet light or X-rays. It just doesn't matter. It's all the same photons. They're just packed more tightly. For the higher, for the ultraviolet light is packed almost twice as tightly as, say, infrared. And but that's the only difference between the two, is how much in a given amount of time, how many photons. So the key function is the structure of the atom, and it's got these internal particles, neutrons, protons, whatever quarks and gluons and whatever else they come up with. But the key component is the electron, and I would argue that the standard model of these rings is probably inaccurate, but it's good enough for gaining an understanding of the fact that these things are connected. I'm tending to think that the way they're connected is interconnected rings, this going out this way. So theoretically, maybe getting smaller as they go further out too, as they get more and more dense. The further you go from the nucleus, the more electrons are able to be held. So you could argue that the smaller the electron, the more you could pack into being connected without them disrupting each other. But the idea would be is that a photon comes in, and depending on the size of the electron it hits, so I would argue that the electron has no frequency, that all the photons are smashed together, and that what's happening is that when a photon or energy comes into an electron, if it comes in a high enough frequency, meaning that it gets bombardments in succession, it causes a disruption in the electron that can free it from its bond, so it can break this connection of these rings, which would break it and release another photon of some other energy, or it can just break free a piece and change the size of this electron, would get bigger, like a photon, a string of photons comes in, 3 photons come in, 1 photon goes out to enlarge the electron, and as that electron goes small again, it would release more energy, in terms of more photons. So energy is always just photons, have a direction, and the energy is always in the direction that the photon's going. There's no mass or energy in any other direction but the direction it's heading. And it can't be created or destroyed. A photon always bangs into another photon. It doesn't. They never have a termination, really. There's no such thing as any energy that has any terminal reality. Every bit of it crashes in. Every photon keeps traveling until it hits another photon, or in the case of the macro, the big world, obviously photons are heading into deep space, and those photons will never come back. They're gone. They won't interact with anything, as far as we know, unless there's some bubble kind of thing they're bouncing off of. It could be some other way they come back, but theoretically, if it doesn't shoot into nowhere, if it stays in the heated universe, the active universe, then a photon will hit another photon sooner or later. That's all they do, is crash into each other. So it's just a bunch of pool balls banging into each other, and sometimes getting stuck in patterns, these circles. And once they're in a circle, their speed of light is still retained. They could be in a double helix, as I've suggested, which would allow them to spin on that helix, which would allow them to have much slower movement in a direction, maintaining the speed of light through the spin. And they would also, could also, just by having an eccentric spin, create an orbit that wobbles, so they have a tendency to move in a direction, to migrate, like a school of fish migrating. And what photons hit them can change that migration, but the photons themselves can't be destroyed. All they can do is have their direction change. So you you can add more direction by taking some of this energy, some of this direction, and moving it this way. So if this photon came in this way and it left this way, it would impart energy in that direction. And that would be basically constantly everything that's happening in terms of the energy transfer in the universe, all just photons kinetically interacting with photons. And the key component to that, to understanding that interaction, is understanding that in those kind of kinetic reactions, if you have two things that collide directly head-on, that there is no change. The universe remains the same. It's as if they pass it right through each other. So there is no transfer, even though there's a direct interaction. Obviously the same is true for if you're chasing a photon moving this way and you're chasing it moving the same direction, you'll never hit it because they're both moving the speed of light. So it's only these interactions where there can be, where there is a directional difference at impact that can create the new circumstance after impact. And the circumstance would involve not single photons anymore, but entire chains of photons that have their own kind of momentum, their own kind of wobble or spiral, and that wobble and spiral is going to be changed based on what photons interact and coming from what direction. And likewise for the entire atom itself, the entire atom structure also has a movement or a vibration or a wobble, and even atoms themselves can be caused to vibrate more based on interaction with photons, creating residual potential to release photons in the future, in the sense that you've created excitement or movement, and that movement will be expressed in some way eventually. For there's got to be a reason why something moves in terms of its arrangement and a kind of potential that exists. And that directional potential, although it all equals zero, I mean, direction is sort of irrelevant. The relevant element is the movement element, the part that's capable of moving. And the key to understanding these matter and energy interactions is that the energy is moving and the matter can't. In many cases it's stuck in a position, so it has to convert the photon into something. It either has to change the direction, or it has to convert the energy into part of the spiral, into a potential for some future movement in some future time when that energy is released, when those photons are released. So anyway, this whole, like I said, this model of kinetic reactions between photons will explain gravity, will explain time dilation, will explain even the lensing around gravity bodies, especially in the area close to the surface where there'd be a lot of electrons and other material bits for the photons to interact with. It explains magnetism. It does unify all of physics to just stay connected to photons and just to find a force and then find how the photons are causing it. If you look for them, you'll find the way that photons are doing it. If you have a phenomenon you don't understand, follow the photons, and you'll understand the phenomenon. And they don't do that with things like the two-slit experiment, and they just take a buy on recognizing that the photons are altered in terms of creating the randomness of their possible end destination, that there's already an effect imposed on them, a filtering that takes place. They call that Newton's rings, in terms of optically creating difference in intensity, and then the slits themselves create surface areas that the photons will interact with. Photons don't interact with matter. Photons interact with the photons that are making up the matter. So they're absorbed and readmitted. One photon goes in, a different photon comes out. Often. Maybe always. There's no such thing as a pure reflection of a photon. This may be a truth. There's no such thing as a pure reflection. All photons are absorbed and readmitted. In some sense or another, the kinetic activity is always with elements of an electron, not matter. And whatever condition the electron's in will decide the new direction of the photon, which explains quantum mechanics. Yeah, so that's probably enough in terms of covering the basics. So it's just all energy is photons, and the rest of it is just subtle changes in their direction, grouping them together and having them in shapes or configurations that are vulnerable to vibrations or disruptions at certain regular intervals will cause them to fall down. It's just like I could poke something with this pen. If I poke it once, it doesn't tip over. And if I poke it twice, but I poke it slowly, it doesn't tip over because it has time to come back to its gravity. But if I poke it twice real fast, then it goes to the tipping point and it knocks the thing over. It's that kind of idea. Electrons have a tipping point, and photons of a certain frequency will trigger that tipping point. Something that simple is the dynamic here. So anyway, no bent space, no photons. Photons do not carry any wave information. They don't, as individuals, they carry no information. You can only carry information using photons by creating changes in the volume of photons you shoot, or how close the photons are to each other that you shoot. But that's it. There's no information you can carry in the photon itself. The individual photons carry no information except a momentum in a direction. That's it. Nothing else. They're not doing anything else. They move from point A to point B in a straight line, and they don't do anything else at a constant speed. Nothing else. Yeah. Right. So we'll call that episode 1, and we'll try to deal with the individual subjects. So gravity first, then magnetism, I guess. So they're the big ones, and then we can deal with the superfluous other issues that show up. Until next time.